Hey everyone, ever wondered what banking looked like before bank vaults, dollar bills, and online transfers? What if I told you it involved cows, literal cows, mooing and all? Well, tonight we're heading back to a time when your net worth grazed in your backyard. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the very real, utterly bonkers story of how cattle powered medieval finance. So if you're curious about how people paid taxes with hooves and saved up for weddings with udders, this is your bedtime binge. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know if you've ever heard of someone trading a goat for rent. Now, let's turn back the pasture pages and look at the world's oldest ATMs, cows. Close your eyes and conjure up a small medieval village. No glint of metal in your pocket, no coin pouches swaying at your belt, no piles of minted silver and gold. Instead, you're surrounded by rolling meadows dotted with grazing cattle. In that world, farmers, barons, and even the occasional monk recognized herds of cows as the ultimate store of value. These beasts weren't just walking stakes. They were living, breathing bank accounts. Think about it. A well-fed dairy cow yielded milk every day. Milk that could be skimmed to make cheese, churned into butter, or simply sold fresh at the local market. That milk was your daily dividend, the steady return on your livestock investment. When the cow calved, that newborn calf represented future capital, a fresh deposit in your herd's net worth. And the cow itself, that was your principal. If you needed a lump sum, say, to pay a dowry, settle a fine, or purchase a plow, you could withdraw by selling the animal outright. In a society lacking minted coins, formal ledgers, and centralized banks, this arrangement was eminently pragmatic. Cows could be traded directly for grain, for barrels of ale, or for the labor of a blacksmith. They could serve as collateral for loans, with creditors holding pregnant cows until the next calf was born. They could be split into fractional ownership, so multiple families might share a single prized cow, each entitled to a portion of her milk yield. It was pastoral finance at its most literal and most fascinating. But let's not sugarcoat it. Many of these bovine banking practices were downright bizarre. Imagine walking into a church expecting to donate a coin, but instead presenting a sleek heifer as tithe. Picture village councils haggling over the health of a cow rather than debating the integrity of a minted shilling. And yet, every arrangement was deeply rooted in necessity. Minting coin was expensive, traveling merchants were few, and forged currency was a constant threat. So folks turned to what they had, living assets that could move, reproduce, and restore themselves, cows. In countless medieval villages, the phrase "one cow" was functionally equivalent to a unit of account, much like how we think of a dollar today. You might hear villagers say, "That plow costs half a cow," or "Her dowry is priced at 2 cows and a pig." If you ran short on coin, well, you probably didn't have coin at all. You could just hawk a calf or part of a cow share instead. Picture a local herdsman arriving at the blacksmith's forge, a quarter share and a pregnant cow strapped to his shoulder. That share might be worth enough to purchase a new horseshoe or mend a broken axle. Meanwhile, the blacksmith might hold on to that share until the cow calves, at which point he claims his quarter of the newborn. If the cow birthed twins, well, now the blacksmith's share doubles. Landlords and lords sometimes minted cow tokens, wooden discs imprinted with a cow's brand that served as small change vouchers. You'd hand over a token stamped with the local lord's insignia, and in return, you'd receive goods. Perhaps a loaf of bread or a flagon of ale. Negotiation over a cow's value wasn't as simple as eyeballing its girth either. Peasants assessed the animal's udders, checked for visible ribs, judged its stance. Any sign of lameness spelled discount. They compared its milk yield, against the cost of barley needed to feed it. They considered its reproductive history. A proven calver commanded a premium, while a first-time heifer might fetch less because of delivery uncertainty. Just like modern investors weigh price-to-earnings ratios, medieval villagers evaluated a cow's market value by calculating how much food, hide, and draft labor it could provide over its lifetime. In many ways, it was more nuanced than staring at a 40-ounce bar of gold and assuming its value was fixed. If cows were the principal, milk was the dividend, a daily, relatively predictable yield that could be sold or consumed. Dairy cows provided morning and evening milk, 2 installments of liquid currency you could portion out however you liked. In prosperous villages, communal milk cooperatives formed. Neighbors would pool ownership of a prized dairy cow, say 3 families owning 1 cow. Each family was entitled to a specified number of pints each day. The family responsible for caring for the cow, feeding, milking, and sheltering her, might reap a share of that milk as compensation, like paying the fund manager a management fee. If a drought struck or disease dulled the cow's appetite, yields dropped, your dividend took a hit. Shareholders grumbled, calling for renegotiation, sometimes even demanding replacement stock if the cow's health deteriorated too far. It was the medieval equivalent of a failing stock cutting its dividend. Everyone wanted to know if their investment would survive until next season's calving. Monastic herds often ran these cooperative arrangements at scale. Monks in a Benedictine house might own dozens of dairy cows, each producing pints of milk destined for cheese, butter, or ale. Lay brothers managed the herd like stewards of a royal account, meticulously tracking each cow's yield. They'd distribute shares of milk to nearby parishes, effectively issuing dividends to loyal congregations in exchange for tithes or offerings. The monastic milk stocks became a cornerstone of rural finance, until a particularly harsh winter turned those stocks sour and forced renegotiation. Calf shares, future heir assets. Selling a whole cow was sometimes overkill, especially if you needed to cover a local tax or a sudden expense. Instead, you might pledge the promise of your cow's first calf, akin to a futures contract. You'd hand over a covenant to deliver next spring's newborn calf. The lender would mark that promise in a parchment ledger, knowing that sometime around April or May they'd receive fresh bovine stock. The details got delightfully complex. If your cow birthed twins, the lender collected premium interest, effectively doubling their return on investment. If there was only 1 calf, fine. But if that calf proved stillborn or deformed, you and the lender entered into fierce debates over who bore the risk. Landlords sometimes insisted on simple, ironclad wording. If the first birth fails, the debtor must repay in grain or another animal by Michaelmas. These disputes could get as heated as 2 medieval traders fighting over a misprinted tally stick. Monastic institutions became notorious for stuffing pregnant cows in their barns as collateral. A monk might issue a calf note to a merchant. Upon delivery of this pregnant heifer, I promise to give you 1 calf in perpetuity. When the calf arrived, the merchant redeemed the note, sometimes auctioning the calf in the marketplace for coin or barter goods. On rare occasions, a monastery might flood the market with a sudden influx of promised calves, causing mini-inflations in calf value. Imagine 20 calf share creditors marching to the barn door when a single cow delivered quintuplets. Sudden oversupply meant the price of calves plummeted. For a brief frantic window, the monastery's treasury reeled at the unexpected calf glut. When you slaughtered a cow, you effectively withdrew the principal, converting live cattle into edible, marketable goods. The meat became pie, roasted joints, salted beef, your medieval cash equivalent that could be consumed, sold, or traded. Once a year, the local cattle fair doubled as a bond redemption ceremony. You'd parade your slaughtered beast, butchers would carve it into standardized shares, loins, brisket, shanks, and traveling merchants would bid on each cut. Each cut was sold at a known rate in barrels of ale or sacks of grain, like a bond being redeemed in installments. Those standardized cuts functioned as edible currency, allowing distant travelers to walk away with a slice of beef worth a day's wage. But not all beef fetched prime value. An old cow or one that had been sick produced low-quality meat. Buyers might shun those bond coupons, offering only a crumb of bread in exchange for a poorly killed beast. When a butcher discovered worms or disease in a carcass, he'd mark the coupons discounted, and the farmer would receive a fraction of the expected price. It was the medieval precursor to a defaulted bond, an asset once thought to hold significant value, now reduced to fodder. Yes, you read that correctly. In villages where winters were harsh and firewood scarce, dried cow dung, shaped into bricks, became a form of energy currency. These smelly bundles, once dried and hardened, burned slowly and provided essential heat. Villagers would cash in dung bricks at winter markets, trading them for other goods or simply using them to stoke hearths on chill nights, like withdrawing energy credits from an ATM. Monasteries sometimes required novices to pay winter heating fees in dung bricks, piling them in a dedicated barn. The wealthiest families hoarded dung bricks throughout autumn, then sold them at marked-up prices when temperatures plummeted. It was the medieval equivalent of an energy crisis. A drought or cattle epidemic could decimate dung yields, leaving villagers scrambling for heat. When supply dried up, markets erupted in chaos. Imagine a frigid December where every dung brick was worth 2 bushels of barley. Families would argue over whose dung was driest, whose was cleanest, and whose free of straw. It was a combustible mixture, literally and figuratively. By the time spring arrived, exhausted villagers paid off their heat debts with a few head of cattle, ensuring they'd never face another dung brick shortage. Once the animal's useful life for milk, calves, or labor had passed, its hide was the next asset. Tanned cowhides served as durable wallets or lightweight barter items, prized for their versatility and longevity. In markets, hides were cut into standard strips, weighed, and exchanged for wool, salt, or iron tools, almost like a savings account you could carry. Guilds regulated hide quality vigorously. A legitimately tanned hide, soft, supple, free of holes, counted as legal tender. Any hide riddled with scars or improperly cured was deemed a contaminated asset, fetching a drastically reduced price. Hide merchants kept vault-like sheds filled with neatly stacked hides, issuing leather notes, promising delivery if that season's tanning supply ran short. Hedges of oaks or poplars often surrounded these hide sheds, providing tannin-rich bark for processing. Tanners and hide merchants formed an early kind of syndicate. They purchased newborn calves, fattened them for 2 years, then harvested hides en masse for sale. If a particularly lean year hit and calves were scrawny, hide quality plummeted and prices collapsed, akin to a savings bank failing to pay interest. Rendering a cow's fat into tallow produced candles that were more than mere sources of light. They were circulating currency. Without glass lanterns or consistent daylight, people needed candles to extend work hours. No candle, no trade after sundown. Thus, tallow candles became a form of cash. Candles varied in length, purity, and fragrance. A long, pure tallow candle made from the fat of a healthy dairy cow might command as much as a sheep's worth at the market, while low-grade tallow bits were exchanged for a loaf of bread. Candle-making guilds regulated denominations. A 1 shekel candle measured 8 inches long, a half shekel candle 4 inches, and so on. By standardizing length and scent, Some candles were dipped in spruce resin or beeswax to reduce odor. They guaranteed consistent quality, much like minting standardized coins. Families wanting to ensure they never went dark at night would deposit pots of tallow in monastic candle banks. In return, they received a wax-sealed parchment note indicating how many candles they could draw in winter. It was essentially a nighttime ATM. You presented that note to the abbot or cellarer, and out came your tallow candles, burning brightly against the darkness. In many manor houses and farm estates, laborers weren't paid with coin, especially on the smallest holdings. Instead, they were paid daily wages in rations of milk-soaked bread. Fresh loaves dipped in morning milk churn served as daily wage tokens, redeemable only at the manor's bakehouse. Picture a field laborer returning from dawn till dusk, paid with a thick slice of soggy bread dripping with cream. That slice was worth a certain fraction of a cow, perhaps 1/20th. The laborer couldn't take that slice to the blacksmith to fix his plow, but he could exchange it at the bakehouse for a fresh loaf. On feast days, that milk-soaked bread might be spiced with honey or aromatic herbs, like receiving a small bonus on your daily wage. If the cow yield dropped, say the herd caught mastitis or a drought-sapped grass yields, milk yields fell. That meant bread rations shrank, thinner slices, fewer pints of milk. Workers scrambled to adjust, staggering their bread draws or supplementing with root vegetables. In leaner times, a laborer might need to work extra hours just to secure a half loaf of soggy bread, much like skipping meals to make ends meet when paychecks shrink. Once slaughtered, a cow didn't just become a pack of steaks or roasts. It also transformed into strips of salted beef jerky, long-lasting, mobile, and highly valued. Pilgrims, soldiers, and wandering merchants carried jerky pouches as portable ATMs. Each strip exchanged for lodging at an inn, a horseshoe from a traveling smith, or a quick loan in a frontier town. To ensure authenticity, top-tier jerky was sealed in wax cloths bearing the producer's mark, much like a bank's signature on a banknote. Counterfeit jerky, thin strips overcured or mixed with inferior meat, triggered local market panics. Rumors would spread that all the jerky in the fair is rotten, sending values crashing until credible producers reasserted control. Annual or biannual jerky fairs popped up in trading hubs, where buyers judged thickness, curing time, and spice rub. Premium jerky, perhaps rubbed with mountain herbs or infused with garlic and juniper, commanded top barter rates. A pouch might trade for a bolt of cloth or several jugs of local wine. At the low end, over-dry strips, chewy to the point of charcoal, sold at knockdown prices, essentially pocket lint in trade. Once the fleeting liquidity of milk dried up, monasteries and wealthy landowners pressed the milk into large cheese wheels, then dried those wheels into what folks wryly called credit crunchers. A single cheese wheel often encapsulated months of milk yield and represented a substantial store of long-term value. Traveling merchants strapped these heavy wheels to ox-drawn carts or strapped smaller wheels onto beasts of burden. To trade them, they'd shave off slices as needed, like cashing in on principle. But if the wheel cracked or bore mold, its market value plummeted. Buyers who purchased a freshly dried cheese wheel expecting years of enduring value found themselves holding a crumbling, worm-infested lump, the medieval equivalent of a bank run on a dodgy bond. Monastic cheesemakers took great pride in their aging cellars. They regulated humidity, temperature, and even the direction of airflow to ensure that cheese wheels matured into the firm, flavor-packed credit crunchers that could be reliably traded. Skilled merchants learned to gauge a wheel's integrity with a quick tap of a wooden mallet, much like testing the soundness of a metal coin by weight and resonance. In some regions, a peculiar market emerged around cattle blood sold for medicinal and ritual uses. Cow blood was believed to cure ailments, fortify warriors, and even protect against evil spirits. As such, it attained an almost mythical value, a kind of red asset class. Healers measured blood shares carefully. A bucketful might fetch the same price as half a cowhide. They accepted blood drafts as collateral, offering to lend herbs or prayers in exchange for a future calf or hide. Outbreaks of cattle disease, anthrax, or rinderpest led to sudden blood shortages, driving up prices. Imagine villagers speculating on who might recover cattle quickly to corner the blood market, similar to gamblers swirling around a stock exchange, betting on emergent cures. Of course, these practices weren't universally embraced. Church authorities sometimes frowned upon the ritualistic use of blood, deeming it pagan or unholy. Villagers courted both sacred and profane markets. They might purchase blood for protective charm from a local ritualist, then donate a calf to the church, hoping to balance cosmic karma. It was a dance between fear, faith, and finance, one where every drop of bovine blood carried both spiritual and economic weight. Fresh cow manure, colloquially called cow pies, wasn't just waste. It was raw, fertile wealth. Farmers collected manure into carts and sold it at fields as high-quality fertilizer. Those who bought manure shares effectively invested in future harvest yields, staking wealth on improved crop outputs. Vendors measured pies on handheld scales. Larger pies equated to bushels of barley in barter. In late summer, cow pie markets peaked. Keen-eyed merchants who hoarded manure during midsummer droughts could command exorbitant prices once autumn planting began. It resembled a future squeeze. Those holding barnfuls of manure bricks found themselves courted by every household with a field to fertilize. Some forward-thinking families even issued manure futures. Neighbors deposited dry manure bricks into communal storage, each receiving a slip of parchment indicating their right to a certain volume of manure at the first fall rains. But many of these deals unraveled when wet summers stalled drying. Farmers returned expecting delivery, only to find moldering piles of unusable crud. Promises fell apart faster than dung in a downpour, and disputes erupted. "You gave me moldy peat, not market-grade manure." Everyone learned a lesson. Never invest in fertilizer futures if you can't inspect the product directly. As we mentioned earlier, small denominations, fractions of a cow, couldn't be moved easily through barter. So merchants introduced cower tokens, miniature wooden carvings of cows that acted as a kind of paper money. Cower tokens were stamped with a merchant's or lord's insignia to ensure acceptance. When someone held a token, they could present it to receiving merchants in lieu of real cattle. But, as with any quasi-currency, counterfeits emerged. Fake cower tokens triggered local market riots. The accused forgers were paraded through the marketplace before lumps of clay masks as punishment. Eventually, guilds stepped in to standardize token size, wood type, and stamps. These standardized tokens circulated widely, though remote hamlets often kept folk variants in secret corners, a form of local hogwash money. As tokens proliferated, younger villagers learned how to calculate small-scale inflation. More tokens in circulation led prices to rise. One token used to buy a hen. Now it only buys a handful of feathers. The emergence of cower tokens forced villagers to think about monetary policy. Who was allowed to issue tokens, how many, and under what conditions? In a sense, these wooden slips were the first local experiment in paper currency, albeit carved rather than printed. When coins did exist, perhaps in border towns or for international traders, cattle vaults were still more convenient. Merchants traveled with multiple hide sacks made of thick, tanned cowhide. These were essentially portable leather vaults that held grain, coin, or small tools without immediate threat of theft or weather damage. Merchants kept careful records of each hide sack's thickness, tanning quality, and security features. Thicker, better insulated sacks commanded higher insurance premiums. If a farmer wanted to store his barley harvest safely, he paid a small fee to deposit it in a hide sack at the head merchant's inn. In return, he received a hide note that he could redeem that quantity later, like a deposit receipt. Occasionally, merchants used hide sacks as interest-bearing instruments. A farmer might deposit 50 bushels of barley for a year, receiving in return a promise that a well-fed heifer calf would be delivered when the lockup period ended. If the sack decayed or was stolen, the grains vanished along with the loan, all analogous to a modern, locked ATM. The fragility of hide sacks in high humidity or infested barns sometimes led to catastrophic losses, prompting calls for better storage conditions. You can't expect to hold a fortune in a sack that's eaten by mice. Finally, let's talk about the intersection of faith and finance. Sacrificial cows as faith-backed securities. Temples and religious institutions demanded livestock offerings to fund community projects, roof repairs, bell tower restorations, or almsgiving. In exchange, donors received assurances. Bring us a young bull, and we'll grant you relief from tithes for the year. These pledges were recorded in temple ledgers like bond indentures. Overzealous devotees sometimes attempted to game the system, pledging old, infertile cows that seemed healthy but produced no milk or calves. Temple auditors, weary of repeated deceptions, introduced hoof inspections. Inspectors stepped on each pledged animal's hooves to detect signs of arthritis or old age. If a foul hoof cracked under pressure, the animal was rejected outright. No bond issuance. During festival season, sacrificial cows were auctioned in the temple courtyard. Villagers flocked to bid. The meat was distributed to the poor, functioning as a form of social safety net. This was an early version of securitization. Temple trustees pooled multiple pledged cows, auctioned them off, and used proceeds to fund charitable distributions. Local priests earned a modest commission, analogous to underwriting fees, while commoners received meat shares to sustain them through lean times. The arrangement both solidified the temple's position as a financial intermediary and reaffirmed the community's spiritual bond. Let's travel back further. Ancient Mesopotamia, a cradle of civilization around 2500 BCE. Here, clay tablets, not coins, were the ultimate source of truth in financial accounting. Families and temples recorded their cattle counts with meticulous cuneiform inscriptions, tracking every birth, death, sale, and sacrifice. Imagine a scribe in Ur or Uruk, stylus in hand, inscribing wedge-shaped marks into a damp clay tablet. The entry might read, "On the 15th day of the month, Nisanu, 20 cows lent to the temple of Ishtar by Enlil Ice, deposit repayable with 20 calves at year's end. Failure to deliver calves incurs penalty of 10 shekels of silver." This is more than just a grocery list of beasts. It's a full-fledged financial contract. Cattle served as the central measure of wealth, far more important than barley or dates. When families experienced irrigation failures or invasions, they withdrew cows from village pastures and marched them to Uruk's trade quarter. There, cattle exchanged hands for dried fish, copper tools, or pottery, much as one might exchange currency today. Less poetic but equally crucial were the herd management manuals scribes wrote on adjacent tablets. They provided instructions for rotation grazing, ensuring no single pasture was overused, plus guidelines for drip irrigation to maintain lush, nutritious fodder. There were hedge loan arrangements. If a farmer needed grain during a dry spell, he could pledge 5 cows as collateral, agreeing to repay with 10 bushels of barley. Defaulting meant the temple appended a new liability to his family's record. often with additional interest owed in work or livestock. The sophistication is staggering. Tens of thousands of tablets found in archaeological digs reveal a world where livestock accounting formed the bedrock of dynastic economies. It wasn't quaint, it was pragmatic. With no concept of fiat currency, Mesopotamians built a complex web of agreements and risk management strategies around their herds. Centuries before medieval villagers used cows as ATMs. Fast forward a millennium or so to Egypt's New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE. Here, pharaohs ruled with divine authority, and cattle reinforced that authority. Massive cattle registers survived on papyrus scrolls, often sealed within temple archives, detailing how many bulls and cows belonged to each provincial governor, priesthood, or temple estate. Imagine touring a sprawling temple complex in Thebes. Priests would lead you to an inner sanctum where they'd unroll a papyrus listing. Year 12 of Amenhotep III, fourth month of Akhet, 150 bulls belonging to the Temple of Amun, 75 bulls belonging to the Temple of Mut, 200 cows assigned to the mortuary complex of Hatshepsut. Each animal was not simply a mooing creature, but a piece of the state's fiscal bedrock. Losing a bull to flood or plague could trigger a provincial fiscal crisis. Governors tracked the beef tax, a levy paid in live cattle or salted beef, to fund temple constructions and royal expeditions. Tomb inscriptions even detail that 500 cattle offerings were set aside to sustain the pharaoh's spirit in the afterlife. Thus, cattle were not just earthly assets but bridges to immortality. Cattle valued in the papyri were graded by breed, age, and color. Black bulls, seen as sacred to Ptah or Osiris, commanded the highest tribute, for their hides and meat were reserved for priests and offerings. Losing a prized black bull to disease could spark inquiries demanding recompense. Who neglected the sacred herd? The outrage was both financial and spiritual, demonstrating how deeply cattle underpinned Egypt's economy, religion, and governance. Farther west, in classical Greece, wealthy landowners, oikonomoi, began forming herd syndicates around the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. They pooled cattle across estates to spread the risk of drought, disease, or raiding. If one animal died, all members of the syndicate would absorb the loss proportionally rather than forcing a single landowner into ruin. Borrowing in the pastoral economy looked like this. A smallholder lacking capital might borrow 5 calves from a coastal trader, promising to repay in mature bulls 6 months later. The lender placed the calves under the borrower's care, monitoring pasture conditions and health. If, come time to repay, the borrower delivered only 4 calves, one had died, they negotiated haircut terms, akin to a modern lender taking less than full principal. The goats and sheep in neighboring villages often served as collateral, diversifying risk across multiple species. Sheepdogs and herders functioned as de facto bank guards. If a borrower defaulted, creditors invoked public cattle repossession ceremonies, where captured bulls were paraded through city gates and displayed before a crowd. It was a spectacle, the humiliation of the debtor, a cautionary tale to others, and a public demonstration of the creditor's power. Meanwhile, philosophers, especially Xenophon in his treatise Oeconomicus, advised prudent herd management. He urged landowners, do not over-leverage your calving seasons. Avoid the frenzy of expanding your herd beyond the capacity of your pastures. These regulators laid the groundwork for an early credit system in Greek pastoral economies. They wrote down contracts, enforced collateral, and invoked communal sanctions for those who failed to repay, or worse, colluded with raiders to kidnap cattle for ransom. Their frameworks echoed across the Mediterranean, influencing later Roman and Byzantine herd accounting. Across the Levant in the Hebrew heartlands, cattle were so central that religious law codified their use in commerce, punishment, and inheritance. Mosaic law addressed cattle transactions succinctly. If an ox gores a man's son or daughter, the owner of the ox shall pay a ransom for the life of the boy or girl. If an ox gores a man's ox or a man's sheep, the owner shall make restitution. If the ox was accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but did not confine it, the owner is liable. The ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner's flesh shall be taken by the owner's life. Exodus 21:28 through 31. These laws govern not only liability, but also the use of cattle as collateral. A man could pledge a calf to a creditor and redeem it within a year by paying the calf's worth in coin or grain. If the calf died, the creditor could retain the pledged grain. If the debtor defaulted, the creditor claimed the animal outright, a contractual arrangement eerily reminiscent of modern secured lending. Inheritance rules played a role too. The firstborn son received a double portion of the cattle herd. Daughters could inherit only if there were no sons, and they received female calves to match. This bovine primogeniture ensured family wealth remained intact across generations, with cattle serving as the primary asset passed down. Rustling, stealing cattle, was considered a capital crime. Communities formed watch herds, rotating villagers who patrolled by night, ensuring no rogue raiders made off with a family's livelihood. When a theft occurred, the entire village was held responsible until the stolen cow was returned or the thief identified, much like communal liability in early European banking guilds. In Anatolia, home to the Hittites and later the Phrygians, the interplay between herding, faith, and finance took on distinct flavors. Temple herders managed sacred herds, whose products, milk, hides, veal, funded oracular cults and healing sanctuaries. Devotees who offered a pregnant cow to the lunar god men expected divine favor on their primary herds, akin to depositing into a sacred ATM for guaranteed returns. Pilgrims journeyed for weeks to sleep in incubation chambers at healing temples, hoping a dream would reveal how many cattle to offer for healing blessings. Those dreams might feature symbolic bulls or cows, instructing supplicants to pledge a specific number of animals. When the ritual succeeded, herders delivered the promised cattle, reinforcing the cycle of faith and finance. If the ritual failed, creditors demanded collateral, perhaps a hide or a portion of milk yield. Seasonal shepherd encampments dotted the Taurus Mountains. These encampments evolved into informal stock exchanges. Herders swapped bulls for sheep depending on grazing conditions, effectively hedging against drought or pastoral scarcity. Over time, scribes recorded these swaps on clay tablets, noting, May 12, 1395 BCE, 40 bulls exchanged for 200 sheep at Luwian Pass, drought adjustment pricing in effect. Conflicts with nomadic raiders prompted protective rituals. Herders fasted and placed sacred amulets on bulls, believing it would repel rustlers. If someone dreamed of wolves devouring calves, an omen interpreter declared that herders should double their night watch, hire extra guards, or sprinkle ash around pens. These apotropaic measures functioned like insurance policies, albeit non-binding. By the 2nd century CE, these ancient herd accounting frameworks matured into disciplined crafts. Greek, Roman, and Armenian scholars translated Anatolian treatises, merging their insights with existing financial systems. Herd registers became standardized, and cattle credit instruments spread, influencing medieval European cattle banking practices. In short, Anatolia's legacy persisted long after the Hittite sunset. Wolves, raids, and supernatural threats haunted any pastoral economy. In Mesopotamia, the Babylonians distinguished between dreams of divine origin and those of malevolent forces. If a herder dreamed of a demon stealing cattle, a priest performed apotropaic rituals, burning cedar incense, inscribing protective symbols on pen gates to neutralize the cursed vision. Egyptians believed that nightmares foretelling cattle theft were curses sent by jealous spirits. Farmers wore amulets bearing the eye of Horus to guard their herds. They recited dream-erasing spells upon waking, silencing the nightmare before it could manifest. Greek herders invoked chthonic deities, Hades, Persephone, to protect against underworld raiders. They hung lambskin charms on pen gates and carved protective symbols into cattle yokes. If they dreamed of chariots trampling bulls, philosophers like Plato insisted it signified unrest in one's household or mismanagement of finances. In response, herders would recalibrate their pasture rotations or negotiate new herd share agreements. When cattle raiders threatened Anatolian ranches, herders would sleep beneath carved idols of the moon god Min, believing their presence would ward off thieves. They performed ritual dances under moonlight, chanting mantras to keep herds safe. In some instances, community elders would gather to bury a live bull at the pen's entrance, sacrificing it to cleanse the land of malicious intent, both a financial and spiritual investment. Fast forward to the medieval period, Islamic scholars translated Greek and Anatolian herd manuals into Arabic, integrating bovine accounting into Sharia law for calculating zakat, alms. A farmer owning 10 or more cattle owed a specific levy each year, proportionate to herd size and health, an early form of livestock tax. Christian monasteries cataloged donor herds meticulously. Donors received cattle scrip redeemable once a pledged cow calved or produced a certain yield, echoing bond interest. Jewish communities in medieval Spain and France used bovine bills of sale to trade across religious boundaries, creating multi-faith cattle credit networks that underpinned local economies. Over centuries, these ancient cattle accounting frameworks evolved into more abstract ledger-based bookkeeping. But the concept of 1 cow equals X bushels of grain persisted in rural economies well into the Renaissance. Even as minted coinage spread, rural villagers clung to their herds as the most reliable wealth. Cattle remained the ultimate ATM, available where no banks existed. Droving and cowbank segment by the dawn of the 14th century, Western Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and free cities, regions where gold and silver coin were rare beasts indeed. Instead, a living hoofbeat echoed through the lowland pastures and highland meadows, the relentless drive of cattle drovers. In those days, each cow was far more than a source of meat and milk. It was a mobile store of wealth, a roving ATM that could be redeemed in distant towns for coin, grain, or goods. Imagine a pastoral landscape stretching from the Scottish Highlands down through England's rolling hills, across the Channel to Flanders, and into the Alps. In rural hamlets, smallholders often found themselves with more beast than bullion. Copper pennies might buy a loaf of bread, but a single heifer could underwrite an entire season's harvest expenses. Thus, droving herds to town markets became the default mechanism for transferring value. Unlike a static barn where wealth lay dormant, a walking herd represented dynamic capital, each hoofbeat a potential transaction in towns lacking dependable coinage. Drovers, often called cowherds or herdmen, would gather hundreds of cattle from scattered farms. They marshaled the beasts into towering columns that, at a distance, looked like writhing black rivers winding toward city gates. As these droves snaked along ancient Roman roads, the same highways laid down centuries earlier, the ring of a distant cowbell signaled opportunity to townsfolk who lacked minted currency but welcomed livestock in trade. In these formative years, where mints were few and far between, cattle droving was the lifeblood of commerce. During harvest festivals, farmers would gather surplus calves and older cows, knowing that a direct sale of livestock was often more valuable than trying to find or mint coin. Towns, starved for meat and animal products, saw drovers as traveling ATMs. No need to carry heavy leather purses of uncertain clipped currency. Just bring the herd and negotiate an exchange rate, cow for coin or cow for goods. By the late 14th century, as mercantilism began in earnest, merchant guilds recognized the inefficiency of sending entire herds across dangerous terrain just to fetch a handful of florins. In Bruges and Flanders, a syndicate of merchants led by figures such as Jacob van Coudenberg and Duchess Isabella of Burgundy inaugurated the first cow bourses. These proto-banks were enclosed marketplaces, large grassy pens ringed by wooden fencing, where arriving droves could be inspected, graded, and assigned standardized valuations. Instead of forcing a drover to deliver a full beef carcass to merchants in Lyon or Frankfurt, the Bruges Bourse issued cow receipts, parchments bearing the drover's name, the number of cattle deposited, and a seal of the local merchant guild. These receipts functioned much like letters of credit. The holder could travel south to a partner bourse, present the document, and redeem it for an equivalent number of cows, coin, or even a partial payout in cheese hides or salted bacon. Early syndicates typically charged a commission, around 2% of a cow's assessed value, allowing them to underwrite keep and feed costs for bulls and heifers held in pens until redemption. Behind the scenes, guild accountants maintained tallied ledgers, long wooden sticks notched to represent each deposit and withdrawal. Every notch corresponded to a beast, its age, sex, and condition carefully recorded. A healthy 2-year-old heifer might be noted with 3 notches, one for principal value, one for estimated milk yield, and one for calf potential. When drovers deposited a group of cows, they watched precisely as stationsmen weighed and prodded each animal, listened for its breathing, and squeezed udders to ensure no mastitis infection lurked beneath the thick hide. These bourses transformed droving from a perilous journey into a quasi-financial transaction. A drover could now travel lighter, burdened only by the lead receipt strapped to his chest. Instead of herding cows to Milan's meat markets, he could dispatch them in Bruges, take the cow note, and either trade that note for local coin or transfer it to another merchant for a share in Burgundy's burgeoning wool trade. In effect, drovers became early bankers, trading animals for paper and paper for market prices. Drovers' routes crystallized into well-worn corridors known by names that still echo today: the Irish to Antwerp corridor, the Scottish long ride to London, and the Alpine passage linking the Italian city-states to Burgundy's wealthy markets. Each path was punctuated by drover inns, rustic, timber-laden lodges erected every 20 to 30 miles, providing secure cattle pens, trough-fed water channels, and barn stalls that squeaked under the hooves of resting herds. These inns functioned as medieval ATMs in their own right. When drovers arrived at an inn, local butchers and bakers would step outside to inspect the incoming cattle. They placed conditional orders. Hold me 3 prime heifers at 10 shillings apiece if they pass muster by sunrise. The innkeeper scribbled these orders into a ledger, promising to notify the buyer once the animals were approved. Meanwhile, drovers negotiated prices for hay, oats, and beer. A tall mug of barley brew serving not only as sustenance but as a nightly fee for sheltering beasts and men alike. Seasonal challenges dogged these routes like a wolf on lambs. The Alpine passes remained buried under snow until late May. Drovers exiting northern Italy found themselves forced to stockpile fodder at precarious way stations, carrying bales of hay tied to pack mules. These pre-funded supplies were often mortgaged against anticipated beef sales in Burgundy or Flanders. In years of heavy snowfall, supplies ran low, and drovers scrambled to trade their hay reserves for local barley or chestnuts. goods that could be more easily transported by cart once roads freed themselves of snowdrifts. The drovers themselves became fabled figures, weather-hardened men in their late 30s, wiry and sinewy, able to herd upwards of 200 cattle over rough terrain. Recruitment notices, often posted on church doors, appealed to young, able-bodied men of proven endurance, willing to serve as custodians of bovine wealth across perilous lands. In return for joining a droving company, a drover received modest wages, free grazing along rolling commons, and a share in the trackage fees turned over by butchers who purchased beef at distant markets. Armed with leather-bound ledger scrolls strapped to their waists, they marked entries each morning. June 3, 1357. Departed Carlisle with 174 steers. 4 lost to wolves. 3 sold to English cattlemen. At York, for 17 pence each. In their tunics, drovers carried a short bow and quiver of arrows for warding off wolf packs in the Scottish glens, and a long-bladed knife for marking verified, unblemished hides that would fetch premium prices in far-off fairs. When returning from a profitable drive, drovers rarely sent coin home, too risky to carry sacks laden with precious brass and silver. Instead, they sent home calf shares, offspring of the herd born during the drive. At inns along the way, during midpoint stops, drovers would claim a few pregnant cows and promise local villagers 2 calves next March. By the end of the drive, a drover's kin might find newborn calves in their barns, tangible returns representing dividends on the drover's time and risk. Life on the droving trails was a precarious balance between survival and profit. Wolf packs roamed the Scottish Highlands, edging closer as dusk fell, their eyes reflecting moonlight like lanterns guiding them toward easy prey. On the continent, the Black Forest concealed bears and brigands in equal measure. A single weakened steer straggling behind the herd invited peril from both predator and plunderer. Bandits, known as jailers, lay in wait along wooded passes, swooping in to seize cattle when drovers lit ephemeral fires for warmth. To combat this, companies of drovers mounted nightly watches, each armed with a long crook to jab stray beasts back into line, and an arquebus or crossbow to deter thievery. Rumor had it that some jailers wore stolen drovers' cloaks, making them near impossible to identify until it was too late. River crossings accounted for another share of heartache. In spring months, thawing snows sent rivers roaring downstream. Drovers at the Bridge of Don in Aberdeen were obliged to pay herd tariffs, tolls calculated per head of cattle. When coins were scarce, drovers often bribed toll collectors with prime heifers, watching in grim satisfaction as their beasts disappeared into village pastures in exchange for safe passage. Worst of all was disease. In the mid-15th century, waves of rinderpest spread through droves like wildfire. A single infected calf turned the entire herd into a moving hospice. Drovers had no option but to continue. Returning the decaying beasts to village pens guaranteed total asset wipeout, equivalent to a modern bank suffering a complete portfolio collapse overnight. Legend holds that in the spring of 1420, Clan MacLeod in the Isle of Skye set the stage for a droving spectacle. 500 cattle would be driven 1,000 miles to London's Smithfield Market as a wager of fealty to King Henry V. The lead drover, Lachlan MacLeod, was a local laird's eldest son turned cowherd, tall in stature, with braided hair and a silver-hafted dirk at his side. He set off in May under skies both blessing and begrudging. Their route took them from Skye's mist-laden shores across the Inner Hebrides, then southeast through the rugged highlands, where clan rivalries sometimes forced the drovers into skirmishes over grazing rights. At Inverness, they paused for a feast among local chieftains who took their cut of the herd as hospitality fees. South of Stirling, a detachment of English border guards demanded safe passage for an agreed tribute: 6 heifers and a cask of mead. Crossing into England, the herd brushed through the Lake District, where English drovers, accustomed to smaller regional drives, gawped at the mass of black cattle flowing like a river through mountain passes. At Manchester, the MacLeods bartered 40 cows for ale and salted herring, sustaining the men through the industrial Midlands. As they descended into London, the smell of peat fires and coal replaced briny sea air, signaling their final approach. At Smithfield Market, a crowd gathered that would change the course of MacLeod history. Kingsmen in velvet doublets pledged acceptance of the wager, provided the herd arrived within 40 days. Lachlan not only met the deadline, but did so in 36, arriving to thunderous applause from London's merchant class. Beef from the Skye cows commanded premium prices, 20 shillings per beast, a small fortune. In return, King Henry V granted the MacLeods exclusive beggar mark rights, a formal patent allowing their clan to operate as the only recognized cattle bankers between Scotland and England. That single Highland March demonstrated how droving could knit together disparate economies. Rural hamlets in Scotland, once isolated by geography, found new pathways to urban luxuries: fine cloth from Flanders, spices from Mediterranean merchants, iron tools from French forges. Suddenly, a Scottish crofter's surplus calf could transform into a silk ribbon or a bolt of Holland linen. Urban centers, in turn, relied on drovers for a steady supply of beef. Town councils in cities like Norwich, Antwerp, and Bruges appointed cattle wardens to oversee incoming drives, ensuring that hygienic butchery practices were observed and local price floors maintained. Consumption shifted. Once a rarity, red meat began to appear regularly on the dinner tables of wealthier guild members, displacing the older reliance on salted fish and grain gruels. Moreover, standardized exchange rates emerged. In Norwich, a healthy heifer in 1385 was guaranteed to fetch 6 shillings. In Antwerp, only slightly higher given transport costs. Merchants used these benchmarks to hedge. If a drover arrived with 100 cattle, knowing the local rate meant they could calculate expected returns, accounting for inns fees and bourse commissions. This knowledge quelled local inflation. Smallholders could predict whether to sell now or wait until autumn fairs, smoothing price swings that once devastated village economies. Infrastructural improvements followed droving demands. Merchants pressured local authorities to pave drover routes, bridge seasonal fords, and maintain safe inns. In some regions, underwritten by guild investments, drover roads were surfaced with gravel and equipped with milestone markers denoting distances, a medieval form of municipal bonds backing road maintenance. By the late 16th century, the financial landscape began to shift. The Medici in Florence and the Fugger family in Augsburg pioneered letters of credit backed by bullion reserves, reducing reliance on slow, perilous droves. Farmers still raised cattle, but fewer herds ventured beyond regional fairs. The postal letters of credit now served as currency highways faster than any hoofbeat. Insurance mechanisms emerged to safeguard drovers. Early insurers would pay a drover 2/3 of a cow's value if rinderpest or brigands decimated his herd, mirroring modern deposit insurance schemes. This coverage, albeit expensive, provided drovers and smallholders with a safety net, encouraging them to invest in herding rather than hoarding beasts in village commons. As coin circulation became more reliable, drover inns gradually morphed into roadside taverns. Their cattle pens, once bustling with lowing beasts, were replaced by iron vaults where merchants stored gold ducats and banknotes. By the early 18th century, the cattle ATM model had largely faded. A farmer would receive a bank-issued bill of exchange worth the market value of his cattle, redeemable in coin at urban banks. No herd needed. Yet the legacy remained. Europe's financial foundations, from stock exchanges that began as cow bourses to modern futures markets trading bovine derivatives, trace their roots to drovers winding herds through medieval byways. Long before medieval drovers bent first hoof, ancient civilizations reverenced cattle as life-sustaining assets. In the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant, cattle were the original currency, the pivot around which food security, spiritual practice, and early accounting revolved. Picture a Sumerian village near the banks of the Euphrates around 1800 BCE. Clay tablet ledgers line the shelves of temple scribal schools, their wedge-shaped cuneiform characters cataloging livestock births, loans, and tithes. To a Sumerian, owning fields held value only insofar as the fields could sustain herds of cattle. Land measured not by acres, but by the number of bovines it could nourish through arid summers. Every morning, temple officials distributed barley and fodder to the village's dynastic herds, rations recorded with near mathematical exactitude. A typical entry might read, month of Nisanu, day 5, delivery, 50 liters of barley beer, 200 shekels of barley grain to cows owned by House of Dumuzid. Adult cow ration equals 4 liters beer, 16 shekels grain. This wasn't charity, it was an investment, feeding cattle that themselves represented family or temple deposits. In times of irrigation failure, when canals choked with silt and fields turned to dust, farmers withdrew cattle from collective grazing lands and drove them south to Uruk for sale. Sacrificing a heifer at the temple, before departure, they appeased Inanna, patroness of agriculture, hoping to restore favorable rains. Should the sale of their cattle net them grain beyond subsistence needs, they reallocated surplus into emergency rations, analogous to modern buffer reserves. Cuneiform tablets detail cattle loans. 10 cows lent to Temple of Ninkasi by Enlil-Kesh, repayable with 10 calves by end of year. Default penalty, 5 shekels of silver or 20 gur of barley. This structured arrangement stands as one of the earliest known interest-bearing contracts. The temple, acting as creditor, often held the pregnant cattle within its pens, effectively securing collateral against default. When calves arrived, they were marked birth date, dam's pedigree, and distributed to depositors, mirroring dividend disbursements in shareholding. Thousands of years later, downstream in ancient Egypt, cattle acquired a divine glow. Memphis and Thebes teemed with temple precincts housing tens of thousands of cattle, sacred herds tended by priest herders. Pharaoh, considered divine, claimed tithe rights over these herds, using them to underwrite temple construction, maintain irrigation systems, and feed workers on monumental projects. Hieroglyphic papyri, like the famous Wilbur Papyrus, enumerate royal cattle assignments. Year 35 of Rameses II, region of Avaris, 1,200 bullocks assigned to the estate of Amun. Cattle rent assessed at 30 grains of gold per head. Each bull and cow was inscribed with papyrus tags, denoting breeder's name, age, and place of origin. Losing a bull to disease triggered a formal provincial inquiry. Who neglected the sacred herd? Who failed to deliver fodder? Cattle rustling was tantamount to sacrilege, punishable by loss of land and forced servitude in temple stables. During major festivals, Opet Heb said, the Apis bull was paraded amidst incense-laden processions. Its death sparked massive funerary auctions. Offspring were sold to commoners, and proceeds funded temple expansions and irrigation canal refurbishments. A single Apis bull could command a price equivalent to hundreds of common cattle. Its genetic and spiritual value ensured its flesh was reserved for priests alone, while its skin and bones became objects of veneration or ritual paraphernalia. In both Sumerian and Egyptian contexts, cattle functioned as both means of subsistence and mediums of exchange. Workers building ziggurats in Ur or pyramids in Giza received daily rations in cattle byproducts, morning meal of oat porridge and fresh milk, midday cheese wedges and barley beer, and evening salted beef or veal. Those rations counted as payment, no coin necessary. Taxes were levied in cattle. A landholder in Mesopotamia might owe 5 cows per 10 arpents of irrigated land, a payment recorded in temple ledgers and rendered in kind. In Egypt, provincial governors remitted beef tithes to the central treasury, often in the form of salted cuts stored in granaries for lean years or future temple offerings. Export markets thrived. Egyptian bulls traversed caravans to Gaza and Byblos, traded for cedar wood and lapis lazuli. Sumerian oxen plowed fields in Elam, their hides sought for leatherwork. When live transport was impractical, cow tokens, small discs of clay stamped with a distinctive cattle brand, served as proxy currency. A trader in Byblos might accept 10 Egyptian cow tokens in exchange for a cedar beam, trusting that those tokens could be redeemed for actual cattle when presented to a Sumerian broker. Behind every thriving cattle economy stood women managing daily herd routines. In Uruk, Yasmina, the brewer's wife, earned her title Mistress of Cattle Accounts. By meticulously logging milk yields, tracking calving schedules, and overseeing the sale of surplus cows at the local bazaar, her day began before sunrise, leading cattle to the edge of the Euphrates for first milking, cradling wooden buckets that would later transform into jars of cheese or loaves of barley bread. In rural Egypt, female temple attendants prepared cow milk beers and cheeses for offerings. Their expertise in selective breeding, pairing bulls and cows with desirable traits, perpetuated dynastic lineages. As societies became more stratified, men took over large-scale pastoral contracts. But in these formative eras, women's knowledge of fodder cycles and herd health sustained entire dynasties through harsh droughts and plagues. Advanced herd management techniques emerged early. Sumerian herders used irrigation canals not only for grain crops, but to create water corridors for cattle drifts. Rotational grazing maps, etched into clay, guided which pastures to rest each season, preventing overgrazing in parched months. An entry might read, Month of Shabbatu, fields of Nippur reserved for north herd, fields of Kish for south herd. Deviating from these schedules risked eroding grasslands, diminishing fodder yields for future seasons. Egyptian priests enforced breed purity. Bulls destined for royal cults had to trace lineage back 5 generations. Pedigree registers kept in temple archives. A black bull with a distinct white diamond on its forehead might be earmarked for Osiris worship, while spotted cows fed local temple altars. Hittite bridegrooms offered prized bulls as dowries, believing that strong bovine genetics ensured future herd vitality. Early due diligence exercised in meat and dairy portfolios. Seasonal transhumance in Anatolia was festive. Communities guided their herds up mountain pastures in spring, accompanied by lullabies and prayers to cattle deities. They believed celestial constellations determined calving cycles. In Hittite texts, an inscription reads, When the Pleiades shine near the horn of Taurus, begin descent to lowland plains. Calves born among gentle rain in the Taurus slopes shall bring prosperity. Such rituals married genetic diversity to economic stability. Cattle occupied a place in the cosmos long before ledgers did. In Mesopotamia, festivals dedicated to Enlil and Ninurta featured cattle parades. Bulls trained to breathe fire via concealed braziers trotted before temple gates, where they were ritually sacrificed. Their meat was distributed to citizens, reinforcing communal social safety nets. In Egypt, the Apis bull's cult transcended Earth. Linked to Ptah and later to Osiris, its living incarnation was revered as a manifestation of divine power. When an Apis bull died, priests embarked on a search across the delta for a calf bearing distinctive markings. Upon discovery, a grand procession escorted the calf to Memphis, its diet of the purest barley ensuring its value both economically and spiritually. Greek pastoralists honored Hermes Creophoros, the ram-bearer, invoking him for protection against predators and theft. Cattle offerings to Demeter during harvest celebrations were seen as a form of religious insurance, guaranteeing fertility of fields in the ensuing year. Among Hebrews, cattle sacrifices at Sukkot provided meat for charity distributions, a precursor to organized welfare programs. Today's livestock markets mirror medieval cattle exchanges in unmistakable ways. Modern stockyards still feature ramp entry pens that echo the cow bourses of Bruges, complete with weigh stations and on-site auctioneers calling bids like 1,000 pounds dressed weight doe. Electronic platforms now complement these physical yards, but the structural DNA remains unchanged. Contemporary rural credit unions offer loans secured by livestock. Farmers pledge cattle as collateral, much as their ancestors once pledged calf shares. Futures markets trading live cattle contracts on exchanges like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange trace their conceptual lineage to Sumerian calf share agreements, where a buyer would reserve one of 10 calves due at year's end. Agritech startups are introducing smart collars that track bovine health metrics, heart rate, grazing patterns, pregnancy status, feeding data into blockchains that assign real-time market valuations. In effect, digital cows have become next-gen ATMs. Investors can buy fractional shares of a cow's future output, a practice that harks directly back to those clay tablet contracts and medieval cow receipts, centuries later, rendered in bits and bytes. From ancient Mesopotamian temple scribes tallying cattle loans on clay tablets to 14th century drovers navigating bandit-laden passes, cows have functioned as society's original ATMs. They issued milk dividends, yielded calf increments, and, when slaughtered, returned beef coupons to those in need of immediate cash. Across cultures, Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Hebrew, Hittite, and medieval European, cattle form the bedrock of transactional exchange, religious ritual, and social welfare. Consider for a moment how these traditions echo in our modern fintech world. Blockchain developers now issue tokens backed by livestock. Commodity traders still monitor cattle futures with the same hunger medieval merchants had for Caledonian steers. Even in our digital economy, fintech cows remain tethered to ancient practice, proof that a living asset can serve as both bank and bond, a multifaceted instrument transcending eras. As you drift into reflection, imagine the lowing of cows as a distant ATM's ding, a reminder that when minted coin failed or mints faltered, people turned to living wealth. The idea that a cow's calf could serve as interest payment, or that dung bricks could fund winter hearths, may sound absurd. Yet these living practices sustained economies and communities for millennia. That legacy endures. Next time you swipe a digital wallet to purchase a grass-fed steak or invest in farmland REITs promising sustainable livestock yields, remember that the cow you see on your plate once stood at the heart of global finance. Its every breath, every hooffall was a silent transaction, a bovine beat drum echoing across the past, guiding us toward a future where value remains as alive as the herds that first made banking possible. With cows as the world's first portable vaults, credit lines, and speculative instruments, we see how necessity and ingenuity turned living assets into banking marvels. As the 21st century hurtles toward digitization, Let us not forget that finance once thrived on the hoof. Good night, everyone.